Hello history lovers and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. And let's finally continue our deep dive into the life of Queen Anne Boleyn. We are in the final stretch now on our coverage of Anne Boleyn, so let's have a look at her last days. Henry was done with Anne, and he was done with the marriage. He wanted his marriage to Anne to be annulled before she was executed, so it was less messy. He tasked Thomas Cranmer with the job of finding a way of legally annulling the marriage, which was hard, as Anne had done nothing wrong. Yet, Cranmer would eventually find a loophole. It was Anne's sister, Mary. The Pope had issued a dispensation for Anne and Henry to be married in 1528. Because Henry had slept with her sister Mary. She had been his mistress. But the Act of Supremacy in 1534 meant that papal dispensations were no longer valid, and as such, Henry and Anne's marriage was incestuous and invalid due to his affair with Mary. The trial of Anne Boleyn took place on the 15th of May 1536 in the Great Hall at the Tower of London. Thomas Cromwell chose the judge and jury, and the Duke of Norfolk was to preside over Anne's trial. Cromwell had set things up perfectly to go his way. One of the 26 jurors was Anne's own father, Thomas Boleyn. She did actually have some supporters in the jury, but they would have to vote the way of the king, otherwise it would be their necks on the line. Anne sat on a raised platform in the centre of the room for all to see. Commoners were expected to stand, but Anne was still Queen of England, so she was allowed to sit. About 2,000 people squeezed in to see her trial. As Anne's trial was about to start, Henry was at York Place in Whitehall. Jane Seymour, who had been absent from court the last couple of days to avoid causing gossip, was at Chelsea. If Anne was found guilty, then a cannon would fire. At 9 a.m, the Duke of Norfolk called for silence. "Gentlemen, jailer of the Tower, bring in your prisoner." Anne entered the room, followed by her 4 ladies. Eyewitnesses remarked that Anne looked in control, and the gentleman jailer had his axe turned away from Anne, as she is currently innocent. Thomas Cromwell leads the prosecution, giving it everything he's got to get her convicted. The only problem is, Anne doesn't actually know what she's being accused of. The indictment that is kept at the National Archives in Kew details Anne's charges. She is accused of adultery with 4 men, Norris, Brereton, Smeaton and Weston. The indictment also suggests that Anne had been conducting these affairs for the duration of her marriage to Henry. It also says that Anne is following daily her frail and carnal lusts, did falsely and traitorously procure kisses and touches of the king's daily and familiar servants to be her adulterers and concubines. These charges were read to Anne in court, and in total she is accused of around 20 acts of adultery. But Cromwell failed to do his homework when he fabricated these indictments, because on at least 5 occasions Anne was heavily pregnant, and on some of the other occasions, she was nowhere near the man in question at the time. An hour has gone by since Anne's trial has started. She is calm and assured of her innocence. She said little, but no one to look at her would have thought her guilty. Thanks to her education, Anne was not only the men's intellectual equal, but also their superior, something that could not be said about most Tudor women. As such, the trial wasn't going Cromwell's way, which must have been infuriating for him, considering he has controlled and planned every aspect possible. The next part of the indictment is read out. Incest. The court records claim that Anne enticed her brother, alluring him with her tongue in the said George's mouth, and the said George's tongue in hers, and their eyes wide open. Anne is also accused of witchcraft. Let's be real, the charge of incest was flimsy, and probably not Cromwell's best piece of work. The evidence is a letter Anne had written to George telling him that she was pregnant. This was deliberately interpreted as Anne telling George that she was pregnant with his child. It also rested upon information that, according to Chapuis, was fed to Cromwell by George's wife Jane. Anne calmly listens to the evidence against her, and an hour later, the Duke of Norfolk sends the jury to deliberate. It did not take them long to reach a verdict. And remember, their decision was also impacted by the trial that took place 3 days earlier. It was unanimous, and Anne was found guilty of treason. She was stripped of her crown and titles. The jury most likely voted in favour of the king's wishes, so that they wouldn't be next. The Duke of Norfolk delivers the sentence. Because thou hast offended against our sovereign the king's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attainted of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death, and thy judgment is that thou shalt be burnt, here within the Tower of London on the green, or else to have thy head smitten off, as the king's pleasure shall be further known. The room erupted at the news, while Anne stayed as composed as ever.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Now, it is worth noting that when the jury decided that she was guilty, they didn't actually specify how Anne was to die, mainly because a Queen of England had never been executed before. For what Anne was accused and found guilty of, she should have been burnt or hanged, drawn and quartered. The National Archives holds the execution warrant for Anne Boleyn. What we can learn from this document is that it is Henry who chose how Anne was to die. We, moved by pity, not wishing the Lady Anne be burnt, direct the Constable of the Tower that on the green within the Tower of London, the said Anne shall have her head cut from her body. It is interesting how it says cut and not chopped. This may help explain why she was beheaded by a sword and not an axe. The document also shows us that they had no idea how a Queen of England should be executed, and that, rather scarily or eerily, Anne's execution was a template or a trial run ready for when it was the turn of Catherine Howard. Beheading by sword was a French style of execution, and it was supposed to be a cleaner, quicker, and more elegant way to go. It's almost like Henry felt guilty about giving her a more gruesome death.
Coincidence? I think not!
Anne addressed the room with dignity. I do not say I have always shown him that humility which his goodness to me merited. I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal. But God knows and is my witness that I have not sinned against him in any other way. Think not I say this in the hope to prolong my life. God hath taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. Now, I think Anne's speech is really telling. She's acknowledging that she knows that what she has been accused of is not really why she has been put to death, and that it is far more likely because she has failed to conform to what is expected of a wife and queen. I interpret this as Anne being an early feminist and that the Tudor court was not ready for the female empowerment that she was bringing in as a strong-willed woman. Now, I know people are going to disagree with me in the comments and probably tell me I'm wrong. But good for you, this is my opinion and how I interpret the statement. I feel like she's acknowledging that she could have been a bit more submissive, like Catherine, and probably she should have, but she wasn't, so... On the 16th of May 1536, the 5 men in the Tower, Lord Rochford, Norris, Smeaton, Weston, and Brereton, were told that they would be beheaded the next day. It was also on this day that Thomas Cromwell convinces Thomas Cranmer to annul Henry and Anne's marriage, despite the fact that Cranmer himself believed Anne's innocence. The marriage was annulled on the basis of some truth, just, and legitimate causes recently brought to our attention. The marriage was null and void, and had always been so. This made the Princess Elizabeth illegitimate and a bastard. She was to be a lady like her sister Mary. Henry's affair with Anne's sister Mary was used to help annul the marriage, as it would have been seen as incest, and the next day, on the 17th of May, Henry and Anne's marriage was declared invalid. Anne would go to the scaffold as the Lady Marquess of Pembroke, not the Queen of England. On the morning of the 17th, a large crowd gathered and watched as the 5 men were led out of the Tower of London and onto the scaffold. Although sentenced to hanged, drawn and quartering, they were given mercy, and their sentence was changed to beheading. It was not so honourable for one to deny guilt if they had been found guilty at a trial. So, when George finally took the stand, block, scaffold thing, he admitted to being a sinner deserving of death. Probably the exact opposite to how he actually felt. George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was the first to be executed because he was the most senior in rank, then Weston, then Norris, then Brereton, and finally Mark Smeaton. As Mark Smeaton was last, the poor sod would have had a scaffold and block covered in blood and a blunter axe. Anne watched this unfold from the bell tower, as its windows overlooked Tower Hill. Understandably, watching these 5 innocent men die aggravated her grief. When the executions were over, a shaking Anne was returned to the lieutenant's house, where she was informed that she would die by sword, and not burnt at the stake. Lieutenant, by the way, I have mentioned this before, is the English and technically proper pronunciation of the American word lieutenant. On the 18th of May 1536, the day that Anne Boleyn should have died, Thomas Cranmer came to the Tower to hear her last confession. Anne pleaded her innocence again, and that she had never been unfaithful to her lord and husband, and that she had never offended with her body against the king. I find this really telling, as they would have taken deathbed confessions, if you like, or last confessions, really seriously, as this is their last chance to get to heaven, and the fact that Anne is still pleading innocence, and the other factors, like not actually being in the places where she was accused of being, means 100%, in my mind, she was innocent. She was just being a bit flirty. Kingston, the constable of the Tower, informed Anne that the swordsman who was coming over from France was delayed at Dover, to which Anne is thought to have said, "I thought to be dead before this time and past my pain." Kingston then replied, "It should be no pain. It was so subtle." It was at this point that Anne put her hands round her neck and laughed. "I have heard say that the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Midday came, and the executioner had still not arrived. Anne, who had prepared herself all day to die, was told that she would now be dispatched in the morning, which meant that she mentally had to go through all of that again, which I can only imagine how exhausting that was. Because don't forget, she is trying to keep up appearances of being a most righteous queen. Something, ironically, if she was a bit more of during her reign, she might not be in the position that she was in now. Cranmer issued a dispensation so Henry could marry Jane Seymour, because he was marrying yet another relative. Henry spent his evening with Jane at Strand, who was already acting like a queen, much how like Anne had with Catherine. Understandably, Anne could not sleep. She spent her last night on earth praying and talking with her ladies. Her mental state once again was unstable. Again, a totally normal reaction, in my opinion. She was quiet and calm, but then she would be cheerful and jokey, coming up with nicknames for her once she had been beheaded, such as Queen Anne Lackhead. I don't know if coming to terms is the best phrasing, but she essentially was coming to terms with her situation, and she believed that her execution was justified for her cruel treatment of the Lady Mary.
I'm fine. I'm fine. yell it out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine.
Everyone in Anne's apartments were awake at 2 a.m. on the 19th of May. The once queen was cheerful, laughing, and joking with her ladies. Sir William Kingston notes that Anne's mood flips between despair and hope that something or someone, maybe the king, will call off the execution, and that this was all a test. I have seen many men and also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow, but to my knowledge, this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. I wonder if Anne was slightly in denial. If she was as innocent as she looks to be, in my opinion, and she would know the truth, then I can imagine it would be difficult to seriously wrap your head round it. The men had public executions. However, Anne was going to become the first person to officially be executed within the tower's walls, as she was going to have a private execution. Cromwell had the scaffold built quickly, and Anne to be gone just as quickly before Henry changed his mind. At 5 a.m, Anne starts to get dressed ready for her execution. Anne usually wore extravagant, colourful French gowns fitting of her status as queen. However, today, she wore a red kirtle, that's an underdress, with a matching petticoat. Petticoats were common among peasants. Everything Anne wore was symbolic. This was her last opportunity for a PR stunt and to fix her reputation. So Anne was trying to come across humble by wearing the peasant's petticoat. Red is also significant for being a colour of martyrdom. Her outer gown was grey or black. I personally like to think that it was black. I think it would have gone better with the red, and I feel like Anne would have known that, being the fashionista that she is, or was. Grey or black was also the colour of piety and sobriety at court, so again it's fitting for this image that she is trying to portray. Her robe was trimmed with fur with a low square neck, and from her shoulders flowed a long white cape. At 7:30, someone, intentional or not we do not know, left the gates open at the Tower of London, and between 1,000 to 3,000 people crowded in to watch the now not so private execution. Amongst the crowd was her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Gregory Cromwell, the son of Thomas, and her stepson, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, who would die a month later, and Anne would be accused of poisoning him.
Right.
Fitzroy's appearance at the event was a stark reminder to everyone that Henry VIII could father sons, the one thing Anne failed to provide him. I've been banging on about Anne's composure, but we have more evidence here to testify how brave she was at facing what lied ahead. Sir William Kingston told Anne to make her final preparations, to which she tells him, "Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have long been prepared." She then proceeded to give Kingston her purse so she could pay the executioner. How charming that she has to pay for an executioner that I'm sure she didn't want.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity and the gumption.
Anne's nemesis Chapuis even remarked she was braver than a lion. At 8:15, Anne was led by Sir William Kingston from her apartments through Cold Harbour Gate to the scaffold at the other end of the White Tower. Today that spot is just outside the Jewel House. Anne, along with her 4 ladies and Kingston, were met by 200 yeomen of the King's Guard, her chaplain, and more guards. It is said that the crowd went silent as Anne approached the scaffold. Understandably, from the lack of sleep, she looked exhausted and dazed, but she was equally stunning. It is thought that she approaches the scaffold and that she is looking around in hopes of seeing a messenger carrying a royal pardon. She would be thoroughly disappointed. At 8:50, Kingston helps Anne climb the steps to the scaffold. Her ladies are weeping. The executioner looks uncomfortable, and the sword has been concealed from Anne under a pile of straw to not freak her out. 5 minutes later, Anne asked for permission to speak. An eyewitness account says that Anne is smiling and had a cheerful demeanour, and in a firm voice she says, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly to the will of the King, my Lord. And if, in my life, I did ever offend the King's grace, surely with my death I do now atone. I come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know full well that aught I say in my defence doth not appertain to you. I pray and beseech you all, good friends, to pray for the life of the King, my sovereign lord, and yours, who is one of the best princes on the face of the earth, who has always treated me so well that better could not be, wherefore I submit to death and good will, humbly asking pardon of all the world. If any person will meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." Some in the crowd got tearful. When Anne is invited to confess her truth, she replies, "I know I shall have no pardon, but they shall know no more from me." Anne then turned to her ladies and begged their pardon for any harshness towards them, and she gave Lady Lee, Margaret Wyatt, her prayer book, which still survives and is at Hever Castle. The swordsman takes off his shoes so Anne won't hear him approach from behind. She removes her headdress and unclasps her necklace, while a lady hands her a linen cap, in which she tucks her hair inside to ensure a swift end. At 9 a.m, the executioner asks Anne for forgiveness for what he is about to do. She kneels and starts her prayers. "Jesu, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The crowd goes to their knees. Her eyes are bandaged. The swordsman instructs his assistant to distract Anne with a noise. He swings the sword above his head twice to gain momentum, and her head is off with one strike. Her head falls onto the straw and people wept. Despite not being liked, the executioner lifted her head, crying in a heavy French accent, "So perish all the king's enemies." While her head is in the air, her eyes and lips move. To our scientific minds, a natural shock reaction to the nervous system after decapitation. To the Tudors, a supernatural-like event of a woman who was praying after death. One of Anne's ladies picks up Anne's bloody head and covers it in a linen cloth. Her other 3 ladies were upset and refused any man to touch Anne's body. The 3 of them together carried Anne away. Kingston noted that the Queen died boldly. At 9:05, Henry would have heard the firing of the cannons that announced the death of the once Queen. As soon as the cannons sounded, Henry boards his barge and travels to see Jane. Upon receiving the news of Anne's death, Jane appeared unfazed, probably because she would be preparing for her own wedding only days later. While it had taken Anne 7 years to become queen, Jane had accomplished it in just under 7 months. Inside the Queen's chambers, Anne Boleyn's falcon badge had been replaced by Jane's symbol, a phoenix ascending from a castle engulfed in flames, surrounded by Tudor roses. An hour later, her body is laid to rest in an old arrow chest from the Tower's weapons store. Lady Lee, Margaret Wyatt, was a chief mourner. Her body was stripped of its jewellery and clothes, which Henry passed on to his new wife-to-be, Jane Seymour. "Here, love, have my dead ex's jewellery, there you go. Merry Christmas." Anne Boleyn was reunited with her brother, George, at St. Peter ad Vincula. Few mourned her passing, and yet within 2 weeks, ballads were circulating, portraying Anne as a much wronged heroine. On the anniversary of her death every year, on the 19th of May, an unidentified bouquet of red roses is discreetly delivered to the tower. These flowers are meant to be placed on the very spot where Anne was laid to rest. In conclusion, Anne Boleyn's fall from grace is a gripping tale of ambition, politics, and intrigue into the Tudor court. It's a story that has fascinated people for centuries. We've explored the key events and characters that led to her dramatic downfall. Her legacy endures as a testament to the ever-shifting sands of power and the enduring mysteries of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of my favourite Tudor consorts. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, for more historical content. And don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments down below, and as always, have a wonderful day.